Hello, everyone. Welcome back to 21st Century Renaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Opiano. I am joined today by my guest, Vaclav Zheng. Vaclav is tuning in all the way from sunny Baltimore. We're very happy to have him with us today. Welcome, Vaclav.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. It's great to have you here. Yeah. Vaclav, I think I'll start out today by just saying a few words to our guests about how we happen to meet and our sort of confluence of interests. Vaclav is entering into the final year of his PhD at hopefully right, we're still waiting on the dissertation defense, but entering into one of the at least the final stages of his PhD in history at Johns Hopkins University, which is near and dear to my heart, having been where I received my undergraduate education. And he is also teaching part-time at the Peabody Institute, which is owned by the Johns Hopkins University, and a place also dear to me, having been a place where I pretended for several years, masqueraded as something of a vocal performance minor, but certainly had a good time with ensembles and opera programs and stuff down there. So Vaclav has graciously accepted my invitation to talk to me a bit today, and to talk to us a bit today about his work on Renaissance humanism, on the course he is currently teaching at Peabody on the historiography of the Renaissance and the historiography of humanism, and also his interest particularly in the Renaissance and in Renaissance humanism in East Central Europe and Poland, which happened to also be the focus of my my PhD, of my doctoral work. If you're listening to this podcast right now, congratulations. This is you're listening to almost the entire field of American-based researchers in the history of the Renaissance and humanism in East Central Europe. So this is it, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, just ask.
Go ahead.
No. I mean, it's
yeah,
just like way too, like there are a few other people scattering, but like basically we don't really have like a field at all yet.
That's right. Yeah, it's as far as fields go, right? It's anticipated in academia, right? At any point in time, right? You have certain studies journals, you have, positions maybe dedicated to your particular field. There are maybe departments that specialize in your field. And let's say the Renaissance in East Central Europe, even kind of early modern East Central Europe, even East Central Europe is not really a field in the United States. So yes, a diamond in the rough, as it were, is Vaclav Zheng. So Vaclav, I'd like to ask you a bit today to get started about, as we think perhaps about this question in orienting, just to sort of refresh our kind of framework here for the show, right? Thinking perhaps about this broader question of why maybe we should care about the Renaissance in the 21st century, right? Sometimes we think about why, is the 21st century going through a Renaissance? But in other episodes, we also think about, okay, in what ways might the Renaissance, or thinking about the Renaissance, say historically, in what ways might that serve us? In what ways might giving our attention to that serve us today? So in the spirit of kind of thinking about that question, I wanted to ask you some questions in particular about your syllabus that you are teaching right now at the Peabody Conservatory. So why did you decide to teach this syllabus on Renaissance humanism at a music conservatory? Maybe you can tell us a bit more about the process that went into deciding to do that and putting that together.
Yeah, sure. First, just a disclaimer that whatever I say is not about particularly about any student. Like it's my global understanding of the field
Mhm.
of higher education within the past 10 years. So don't take personally if my student or former or current student look at this. So like basically, I have been creating or I have been taught several courses at Johns Hopkins undergrads. I've created several very different courses on history, on theory, seminars. And I'm very free to teach any like survey courses on, early modern Europe or medieval Europe. So this is my first try to give a course on sort of like a entire historical period, which is on Renaissance.
Mhm.
Although I cannot teach the whole Renaissance, right, from the 14, 15, 16, right, the Trecento, Quattrocento, Seicento. So I pick a theme, which is humanism. So which is this course is a intellectual history about the Renaissance or the scholarship about the Renaissance. While we also read other, primary texts. Um, this course is as a part of the core curriculum for the PhD music students,
Mm.
freshmen mostly, because they have to, beyond their like musical training practice, they have to take a series of liberal arts courses that emphasis on writing, speaking, reading,
Mhm.
critical thinking, that kind of skill building thing. So this course will be a perfect one for them to learn how to do research, how to read stuff, how to think about the past,
Mm.
which is a rare one at Peabody and also at Homewood. Actually, now we don't have a Renaissance course offered regularly.
Really, really. So, I was going to say, I know, well, one of my instructors in undergraduate, Christopher Chalensa, is one of the more
Mhm.
foremost, one of, yeah, I should say, if not the foremost, one of the more, would you wouldn't say one of the more foremost, but something like one of the more prominent, perhaps that's what I'd like to say. One of the more prominent scholars um, in the field of Renaissance humanism, in sort of the intellectual history of Italy during the Renaissance. Um, I understand, he sort of stepped into more of an administrative role at Johns Hopkins. So I take it maybe he's not doing as much regular instruction in that area. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he does offer like a freshman seminar once a while. But within the department, we are not really offering anything on the Renaissance. I mean, I think this is also the national trend, right? Like
Hmm.
there's
Hmm.
more a decolonizing effort
Yes,
in the entire North American or Anglophone academia. So people are hiring and offering more courses in the subaltern world, right? In Latin America, in
indeed.
Africa, in Asia. And so Europe becomes the kind of the victim of this, especially the Renaissance, which kind of emphasizes this like great books, right? Great minds,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
canons became the problem, the target,
Hmm.
so that it is not no longer favored um, in course teaching, that kind of
Yes.
stuff. That's why exactly like I see that you ask every speaker that is there a Renaissance now, and I was wondering like why everyone was saying yes. Can I say no? Like I was like there's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
like at least within the field of history, I don't think there is a Renaissance or there's a focus on the Renaissance history at all. If there's a Renaissance history, this is not intellectual history. Like we're looking for more social, more like from the below perspective, right? Like
Mm.
there are books that are entitled like The Ugly Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is not that
Mm.
kind of beautiful classical learning, eloquence, no more that, right? If we look from
Mm.
the plebeian perspective, there's all violence, right? Adultery,
Mm.
people killing each other, peasant revolt, everything could happen within this Renaissance umbrella. So people are try to, decolonize, decode, even like break
Yeah.
down this Renaissance term. Um, Unlike we have this like Renaissance intellectual history, which is a very different
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, well, there are two points there I think I'd like to pause on and maybe dig a little deeper with for you, especially for our audience, right? Okay, so right, we both come from right. You're at the end of your sort of graduate school term. having spent, I think, at least this is your sixth year at Johns Hopkins, yes? Right. So you've been ensconced in this for over half a decade, right? You also, I'm sure, were exposed to some of this in undergraduate. I just submitted my PhD back in fall of 2022, so I'm sort of fresh out of this as well, right? These ideas of there are two things I noticed that you mentioned that maybe some of our audience who doesn't necessarily come from an academic background might pick up on or immediately be able to connect the meaning of, especially as academics tend to use it. One of them is this term decolonize, which is now sort of in the past few years has been kind of spilling out into the public consciousness through social media, through various media outlets. I think in particular, most recently, something like, and we don't have to get into this topic, but the recent Israel-Gaza conflict is one where sort of the term decolonize has been something circulated quite a bit more. And the other is sort of this process of deconstruction. So the idea of deconstructing or taking apart the term Renaissance and what that might mean. So I'd like to actually ask you about each of those points. Could you speak a bit more when you say decolonize or decolonization? What does that mean in an academic context? How have you experienced what that is, and how that has been taught in your graduate experience thus far?
I don't know. I mean, first of all, I'm not part of this discourse. I'm very adjacent. I'm just observing because I don't know. Like Poland's working on early modern Poland is very interesting and special position in this whole thing. Well, first of all, like decolonization is definitely necessary because say we have like 200 books written on 16th century Italy and maybe only 5 on 16th century Mexico, right? Like definitely we should move some part of the effort and attention to move less understudied field, give more attention to people who have not been recorded sort of in historiography. So we definitely should work on that. But there's also a whole like a political or even politically charged force behind this. But why I'm saying Poland is special because Poland is part of Europe, but it is not part of the Western Europe, the Europe that people have been talking about, discussing for centuries, right? So like technically speaking, Poland should be part of the decolonizing group, right? Like because Poland was less studied. Nobody's working on this, so we should definitely move from Italy to Poland. But on the other hand, Poland is part of Europe. So when people are talking about decolonization, this is disregarding the whole entirety of Europe and move to other parts, say South Africa and other parts of the world. So it's sort of like Poland and East Central Europe missed its chance in this movement. So it missed its historical chance. I don't know, like
okay. Yeah.
basically, like I could be a decolonizer, that word, decolonizer within European history, but I'm not in the world history, so to speak.
I see. Okay. So yeah, it's an interesting term, right? Because it has this sort of idea of, well, okay, if there's this thing, if there's colonizing, if there's say settling territory that doesn't belong to you or something like that with your culture and with your foundations or something like that, right? It's an interesting term to use given that what's being called for is sort of the opposite direction, right? It's like, okay, if you're an American scholar and you come from, say, this Western European tradition, decolonization is actually going and focusing on places that were colonized rather than places that say that necessarily originated from independent of any time period.
Well, we can think of it as like a historiographical colonization, right? Like if like so far, like all books on European history If it is not specified as Eastern European or Eastern European history, it's always on Western Europe or even on England, France, maybe Italy, right? Like, so whatever themed book on European history is always in the Western Europe. We does not cover Eastern Europe, even though Czechia, Poland, Hungary were part of the Latin West in the pre-Enlightenment mentality, right? So we should be part of the Western Europe, but we're not covered. So that's a really big problem within the historiography, within history writing.
I see. I see. Okay. So I'd like to move over to this this question of, say, right, you brought up this idea of right now perhaps there's something of an attack on the great books, or perhaps if not an attack, a sort of enthusiastic attempt to de-emphasize things like great books, de-emphasize, and typically great books mean works of literature or the intellectual tradition of, right, Athens and Jerusalem is sort of the part of what's tossed around a lot in classical education circles, but also, say, Latin and Greek, and maybe also those cultures that revived the Latin language or made new use of the Latin language in the early modern period during the days of early print, and founded perhaps much of the origins of the modern academy as we understand it today. Where does the Renaissance fit into that, right? You mentioned that the Renaissance is perhaps something that in the decolonization effort people are trying to get rid of. Where does the Renaissance fit in that? Why is that something that maybe we should think about in the context of great books, or is that something that should be thrown out, or is that something that we should be holding on to amid this sort of decolonization emphasis? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Like, I still think there's value in the great books, in the great minds. People have been reading those for like centuries, right? And exactly my course on Renaissance humanism is kind of like a counter force, speaking kind of against those kind of decolonizing power. Like, wait a moment, like let's say there's actually something there that we should first read them, right? But we don't have to read everything, right? It's not like a course on Renaissance humanism must include Petrarch, must include, like a certain Machiavelli, right? We can be a little bit more creative. But again, like we should read them first and think of them along with the scholarship on these works. And then we can kind of have a criticizing point, like saying, okay, these are not good enough, or there's some problem. Like, then we can have a criticism. But then we should not just not reading them, like putting them away. I think that's not good, at least for like the high schoolers or undergrads. But we should let them read them, and then you can have your own opinion on these things. That's why I kind of give people from Petrarch, Bruni, Machiavelli, Castiglione, like all the Italian canons that everyone should read, Boccaccio, like, right? And then on the second half of the course, I also throw them a little bit about the Renaissance, Northern Renaissance works, right? The Spanish Renaissance, French Renaissance, German, Low Countries, Polish Renaissance, right? Jan Kochanowski. Next week, I'm going to read with them the Treni, right? The Laments poetry of Jan Kochanowski, and also a little bit about Croatian Renaissance. So a little bit of everything. That's exactly what I see as a decolonizing course could be like, right? A little bit diversity, that would be good. But still, we should still center Italy as the most important part, while not ignoring the other parts of the Renaissance. Although there's also terms on global Renaissance, like, but I'm not part of that yet. So like within this European world, we should give each country some attention, like 1 week, one reading at least. So that's something I'm doing in my course.
Okay, interesting. So I see. So I did have a look at your syllabus, right? And it does seem that in this, right, it's a 1 semester syllabus, right? And I'd say probably about yeah, the first half of it is centered, maybe a little bit more than half is centered on these uh, say the Renaissance in Italy and these canonical texts that you've referred to. And then about the last third to a half, somewhere in between there, yeah, you devote each week to sort of a different region. So to this extent, my first question is, what has been your experience teaching students this syllabus, teaching them about the Renaissance through the lens of humanism, exposing them to these texts? What are some of the key takeaways that you've either sought to impart to them, or that you've noticed that in particular they walked away with thinking had some particular value to it, that they were sort of pleased to have learned, that they really sort of grabbed onto in the context of this core liberal arts course at Peabody?
I mean, first of all, I think they should know these names of the authors of the works, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I give them like announced pop quiz that are not counted into their grade. I should do that. They at least they should memorize those names. They should get a little bit
Mm-hmm.
feeling about like how although in English translation, the prose, right, the flow, right, some
Mm-hmm.
sort of like classical allusion. Then I have to give them another course on the classical world, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It seems like these this generation students they kind of they need more background in humanities in their high school
Mm-hmm.
training. I don't know, like I feel like people are kind of not knowing a lot of factual things that we assume that they know, right?
Mm-hmm.
For example, like when we talk about Castiglione and his court culture, right? And I've been talking about for 20 minutes about what the court and how people could do nice like this eloquence manner, all this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Literature, art. And then a student asked me, okay, are you talking about courtier as like, you know, dating and relationship? And then, oh no, that's not that kind of,
Yeah.
it's another kind of court. Okay, then I have to start from the very beginning, like what is court, how king, counselor, all this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Starting from the chivalry culture maybe. But so it's very interesting to see like where people are and where you are. You have to bridge this gap, to make
Mm-hmm.
people get all these basic facts, right? And I also do like on Tuesdays I do all the like classic texts, and on Thursdays I
Mm-hmm.
give them some scholarship to read. I probably
Okay.
shouldn't do that. Like it sounds like a graduate level course.
Mm.
But I think like people read those classic texts with scholarship by the pillars in the field, right? Like um Oscar, Baron Christaller, Polska
Mm-hmm.
Christaller and Guerin, and then later Hankins, Salazar, like this kind of generations of intellectual historians of the Italian Renaissance. And then they could read like, like side by side and see like, okay, what
Mm-hmm.
those work could actually exemplify, right? Is there classical learning? Is there like a humanism, sort of like contemporary with the scholasticism or not? Is it one after
Mm-hmm.
another, right? Is this like an Italian thing or it could be a French thing?
Mm-hmm.
Like is Renaissance humanism a philosophy or is it just like a kind of profession, right? As rhetorician, a grammar teachers,
Mm-hmm.
or it's
Mm-hmm.
more
Mm-hmm.
like on the civic side, right? The civic humanism is a part of the political campaign
Mm-hmm.
movement. So we can definitely talk about these things. Like people could give their own opinions. So
Mm-hmm.
on that aspect, I think I'm very open. I'm very decolonized, right? So people could have their own voice here. And
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
also asked them to write a research paper on an author that they like the most. Like I gave them like a list of 200 authors,
Oh, okay.
Italian and also European, like all the names. I shouldn't do that again. Like that's not for undergraduate students, but I think it's a good try experiment for people to pick what they like and write a paper on that. So I have people writing on Erasmus, Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe, and right, like so it's very diverse course, like free, off, hands off. I think everybody will take something from it. that will enrich their own practice composing career, right? Like they could definitely
Yeah.
draw allusions, references from the course, right? They could have like a Machiavellian opera or something like that. I hope.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's okay. So that's interesting. I particularly like I particularly like that approach, right? So, I even try to do this in some of the high school or homeschool classes that I've taught, right? I particularly like, so I guess to sort of delineate this for our audience a bit, right? Um, Typically in teaching history and historical pedagogy, we approach things with, or we are trained to approach things with either through primary texts, right? The sort of archaeological documentary records of the time period. Something like, if you're doing literary history, okay, works of literature would count as a primary text. If you're doing, say, legal history, okay, legal documents are going to be your primary texts, and so on, various archival documents, right? Whatever is right. I've used this term before with some of my students, right? You want to think about the sort of research that a historian does is something like documentary archaeology. If the archaeologist is out there, digging up rocks and looking for context in the site to, figure out what this pottery shard might mean, the historian is trying to do that, but with preserved things that are on paper and sort of written down, right? So primary texts sort of fit into that, right? What people in the time period actually wrote. Whereas then secondary texts, secondary sources are going to be what more recent people who have read a bunch of these documents have to say about the time period, what they think was going on, their reconstructions from sort of our point in time or more recent time. And I really, yeah, I like the way that you approach that structure.
Right,
I
and
think
sometimes the secondary sources could be primary sources if you are studying them as your historical figures, right?
yes,
Like I asked my
yes,
students read a paper on Bookhart, right? Jacob Bookhart on Baron, right? On Christaller, and then they become your primary sources because I'm
yes.
also like beyond intellectual and cultural history of early modern century, but I'm also studying historical theory, historiography. I'm
Okay.
deeply devoted to those kind of topics,
Hmm.
right? More recent contemporary historiography. So I have both
Hmm.
perspectives. I cannot teach all the social history stuff, like they are very
Sure.
abstract to me. I don't know why, but I'm really a I'm a literature person.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
Maybe you
that's,
are
I mean, I
also.
think if you're gonna,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a reason I think both of us were drawn to the Renaissance, and it's, yeah, dude, understanding these texts, these great works of literature, right? But I think on that point, right, if I were, let's say, right, if we were in the decolonizing sphere, if we were in the decolonial space, as it were, um, you've mentioned this term diversity a number of times. I think there are some people, some colleagues within the academy, right, that might say, I'm tempted to play devil's advocate here and say, like, well, you say diversity, but why should why should the university student of today care about what these old dead white men have to say, right? All of them from say 500 or 600 years ago. What is it that these particular people in the Renaissance did that the student of today should care about? Harumph, scowl, expected answer, right? Something like that. What do you think if I were to propose that, right? Generously.
I don't know, like I think first of all, like people should read them
Mm,
before criticizing them, right? You cannot just say Vala is useless, Pico is evil, Boccaccio is obscene. They cannot say that, right? You have to read them first, right?
mhm,
Read them like from beginning to the end, right? Because it seems like people today are not reading enough, right? They
mhm,
are just,
mm,
looking at Wikipedia, but that could be our generation, but now like
mhm,
it's in the TikTok age, so people would read Spark Notes or even ask ChatGPT about the synopsis, right? They're not reading
mm,
anymore. People are not reading, especially the paperbacks, right? Like they're reading from their laptop and the
mhm,
Kindle. So that's always a problem. So the first thing I think Renaissance could teach us is the idea of reading, both reading as a concept or reading as a practice, right? Like we should read more, we should, just absorb a lot of things before we give comments, right? And the
Mm.
whole idea of diversity, I think, is like we should get a little bit of everything. That means diversity. It doesn't mean like total
Yeah.
subverting. We cannot just say, okay, we're not liking Renaissance, the word appearing on the syllabus. I don't think that's a constructive move
Mhm.
here, right?
Yes, I would certainly agree with you. I would that's I suppose how I would understand the term diversity. Though I do know maybe there are some people in the academy, quite a few people perhaps outside of the academy, in the decolonial space who might say, well, diversity doesn't include anyone. What's the concentration perhaps of terms. If they're, white, meaning sort of from a European background, if they're sexually attracted to women exclusively, if they worship in a Christian tradition, and if they're men, right? That's sort of the unholy tetrarchy of of decolonial attributes, right? But we don't have to delve into that topic to quite any specific depth. Um, so
And also maybe like just give you like a new perspective, like
yeah.
within the field of historical theory, or we call philosophy of history or
Hmm.
historiography. In the analytical tradition, there's a term called the colligatory concept. I don't know if you have heard of this. It
Hmm.
means it's philosophers, they're watching historians practice, and they name this term as kind of like all the terms that historians create
Hmm.
and use to grasp kind of like a central idea of a certain time period,
Hmm.
which include Renaissance, Cold War, Revolution, right? Even including late
Hmm.
antiquity, all the like artificial intellectual concepts, which Renaissance has become a hotbed in this discussion because they are always asking like, is Renaissance a realist term or is it anti-realist? Is something historicist or is something totally constructionist or even postmodernist term,
Hmm.
right? That is not does not indicate the original meaning, right? The reviving the Renaissance, right? Revival, classical revival anymore, right? This becomes a really important discussion in the field of philosophy of history. And I'm going to present a paper in May on that. But I'm always thinking like
Okay.
the term Renaissance is very interesting. Like although it's kind of like historians are kind of moving away from this term, like use more neutral term, like could be early modern. But although early modern is
Hmm.
also loaded, right? We have the early modern, right? Like it must be more than that. That's another discussion,
Yeah.
right? Different from medieval, which sounds like backward. Maybe people prefer to use more like a centennial term, like centuries, right? To kind of not have like a Renaissance connotation. And also Renaissance has been used and abused in the historical field, at least
Hmm.
by many people, right? When people talk about Renaissance, they always use it nominally, right? Just like
Hmm.
indicating the centuries, give you like a temporal sense. Others will
Hmm.
just use it very contradictively, right? They will say, like, okay, Renaissance, violence in the Renaissance, right? To give you a sense of this contrast, right? We are not talking about all classical learning, the good, juicy stuff, but there's also the dark side of it. And also, like people use Renaissance in other scenarios when they talk about, the what's called the Charles Hoskins, right? Like the
Hmm.
medieval Renaissance, 12th century Renaissance, the Ottonian Renaissance, the Charlemagne Renaissance, even more recently, like the Harlem Renaissance, Jewish Renaissance,
Hmm.
20th century Renaissance, even 21st century Renaissance, right? That's another borrowing from the term, and which could be, connotated or not, right? So it has been used wildly to kind of have with different intentions, I would say.
Well, I suppose I could ask you this then, right? I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, right. I sort of mentioned this. I remember speaking about this. I think I have a little note of this somewhere in my dissertation. I remember talking about it at my defense, but this sort of question of, you know, is is Renaissance really just one of these historic, academicist, jargony type words? Like, is it really just an empty temporal period and we could just exchange that for early modern, right? Because, for example, Yale University now no longer has a Renaissance studies program, right? That's right. I had my PhD is technically a combined PhD, so I had this sort of extra coursework, extra field exams, extra things like this, in order
Renaissance
to
studies?
in Renaissance studies. So I had this whole parallel series of sort of coursework and oral fields going up to the dissertation as a part of that. That's been discontinued, right? That's not there anymore. That was discontinued, I think it was discontinued, I think 2022. So the year that fall 2022 is when I submitted my dissertation is gone. So now there is something called early modern studies, but basically the argument for the founding of early modern studies was twofold. One, there are no Renaissance jobs, so the university has a responsibility not to train specialists for jobs that don't exist. So it's, on the one hand, it was pragmatic, but on the other hand, it was that the Renaissance label is too Eurocentric. And by saying Renaissance, you disallow the study of other areas of the world. And so by saying early modern, you've now opened up the spatial component without sacrificing the temporal component. And sort of my concern there was, that's not how I ever understood the term Renaissance at all, right? I did understand, right? I mean, okay, yes, there is a thing called the European Renaissance. And yes, there is a time period which, like, the age of the Renaissance, right? People do have this notion. But there's also some sort of, my perspective was always that there's some sort of natural philosophical concept of Renaissance, that there's something culturally going on that maybe, it's a difficult pattern or a sort of distanced pattern to see. But once you see it, right, that's the name that's given. There is a revitalization, there is a rebirth, there is a sort of cycle, a transcendent natural pattern of death and rebirth, and that is manifest in some way in the time period in Europe, with the capital R Renaissance, yes. But that the proliferation of the term Renaissance with an R, with a lowercase r perhaps, or 12th century Renaissance, like you said, Carolingian Renaissance, Antonian Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance, that something is actually happening, right? It's not just, some people started making some more art, like they're, because it looks nice, or because, it's connected to power or something like that, even though that may be the case. It's like, that was sort of my position on it. And sort of part of why I have this podcast in general is to say, like, I would like to have these types of discussions. Is there really something else going on with the Renaissance, or is it really just, a temporal marker? And early modern does the same thing, but it just widens the spatial gap. Is there really nothing underneath that temporal and spatial significance? I would ask you that question then, since we've gone down this road. What do you think? Is there something else there to the Renaissance?
I mean, first of all, like early modern is not a neutral term at all, right? It indicates the sort of early modernity, which does not apply to most of the world. You could say like a 19th century Japan, China as sort of more pre-modern than early modern. Like you could always argue the other way, right? And also the medieval, right? Say in Poland, there's nothing called the ancient world, so there's no medieval, maybe there's no Renaissance, but so all those temporal markers are just more indicative. But in terms of the content, the meat of it, I think there's definitely a value here. Talking about this historiographical, in historiography, this kind of historical fashion trends, right? Kind of going down, up, down, like that kind of thing. Which it could be linear, but I think it has value to kind of describe kind of a certain kind of culture or phenomenon, right? Say the reading of Plato, right, or the reading of Cicero, it kind of goes, it was one thing at one time, and then it kind of nobody kind of read it, and then it come back. So it's definitely a real thing, I think. And regarding the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, I think the Renaissance still exists as a culture, right? In its original meaning, the classical revival, and I think it has values there. Um, and also in Poland people kind of pick up those learning, although not as the old learning, right? Maybe for them it's quite new. I don't know. Like I think we should still think about the term, but still use it, because early modern could start from the 15th century, maybe 16th century, but it does not. I mean, there's something, or like today people call it the late medieval and early modern, right? That's a term to be like neutral.
Sure.
But like if you want to talk about more intellectual stuff, then you should use the term Renaissance. I think like artistic movement, sort of like a Baroque, Enlightenment. All those terms are valid. We cannot just get rid of it easily, right? But we can definitely wrestle with those terms and give them new definitions, sort of, right? We can talk about intellectual Renaissance. We can talk about other sorts of popular Renaissance, right? Even other kind of things. I don't know, like I should
Okay,
think more on that.
Yeah, it's right. I mean, that's something I've been thinking about. That's something I've been thinking about for a while, right? And I've tried to think about it, from the perspective too of, say, biologically or psychologically, right? We tend to in this sort of area or era, not area, but era of social constructivism, especially in the academy, there's this we run into this roadblock of thinking that something like culture works like a machine, but that it's something that, right, human culture rises up out of our biology, because it is right. If you think about, okay, culture is a product of institutions. Institutions are a product of habits. Habits are a product of behaviors, and behaviors are extensions of our biology. We are the biological makeup of organisms is configured in such a way as to motivate behavior. So, right, this is all connected in a chain, all down, right, microcosmically, as small as you want to go.
And there's also the environmental climate kind of claims, right? Like which kind of change the whole history of human beings.
Yes, well, of course, right? We are greatly affected, right? Our behaviors are greatly affected. Our moods are greatly affected. And even without climate change, like you want to call climate change, like going from summer to winter is climate change, right? Like look at how different human beings act when you change from summer to winter. Like we become different. We become different organisms. We don't behave the same way. Like we have some similar behaviors, but like our affective states are completely different. Our values change, where we want to spend our time. Our health differs, our orientation toward food, like changes tremendously. So yes, that happens on a micro scale, throughout the course of the year, but also happens on various macro scales over the course of centuries. Sure, you can put climate in there too. We can't be extracted from our environment.
Yeah, exactly. Like we will think about the pre-modern age, especially in Eastern Europe, right? That this forestation, the whole kind of outlook, landscape, right? And also the very small cities, right? Especially in Poland, right? You can actually walk from one end to the other gate within maybe 10 minutes, right? Like so it's very small cities, a very natural environment, forestation, wild life. So in that kind of environment, many people are homeless, they live in the wooden houses. Then you are reading Greco-Roman literature. That was kind of amazing for me. Like they don't have that kind of like natural resources for them to sustain their lives while they were reading all the good past stuff and think about the future of the state, think about the ideal society, the ideal kind of statecraft. That's something is amazing to me. So we cannot undervalue this kind of aspect. It's not we're reading not in the air-conditioned room and reading those books on Kindle, right? So it's a very different world.
Yeah. Well, perhaps that makes a good transition for us, right? It sounds like, you're identifying perhaps this deeper cultural, for lack of a better term, structure, but phenomenon, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
of the Renaissance has something to do with classical revival, of sort of idealizing a prior time period. I think, in the context of humanism, it seems to me that this is the outlining of, say, the golden age of Latin
Mm-hmm.
literature. I think this sort of golden and silver age kind of comes out of kind of late humanistic philological scholarship and the foundation of classical philology as a discipline. But right, idealizing this time period, being particularly interested in finding these old texts and translating, especially Greek texts, into Latin so they can be legible. Um, what right that means something that has a particular meaning in Italy, and we point to Italy as being the place where that had its genesis for perhaps a variety of factors. But this sort of ties in with your idea of, I guess, diversifying an approach to the Renaissance, um, diversifying an approach to humanism, and thinking about, as you teach your course, um, thinking about presenting the Renaissance in a number of different geographical contexts and cultural contexts. So does the Renaissance, what do you think? Does the Renaissance mean something different? Does classical revival mean something different in say Poland? Does it mean something
That,
different?
yeah, that's a very interesting term like, when we're speaking about Poland or a Central European
Hmm.
world, especially Poland. People kind of agree like there is some sort of renaissance going on, especially in architecture. Right? That's a big thing, right? Like there are
Mm.
so many Italian architects coming to Poland under the patronage of the noble families, and they built
Hmm.
castles, palaces, even cities, right? Like we talk about Casimir Stolony, we talk about
Hmm.
Zamość, right? All these things were built by Italian architects, so they're sort of the Italian style. But then there's another problem, right? Like is Renaissance in Poland a Polish Renaissance, or is it just a branch of Italian Renaissance that kind of
Mm.
opens kind of retail store across the Wisła, the Vistula River?
Mm.
Right? Are those decisions made by the Polish patrons or just by the architect themselves? Brando
Mm.
Morando, they are replicating the Italian um, ideal cities in Poland. So that's
Hmm.
definitely a really good question to think. Like I think there's still something unique about the Polish Renaissance. It's not the Italian branch. I would
Mm.
argue. Not only in art, also in literature and in history, right? Because as historians, we tend to think big, right, more than
Hmm.
the texts themselves, right? Like we think about the whole 16th century, even late 15th century that you are working on,
Hmm.
right? The early
Hmm.
Polish
Hmm. Hmm.
humanism, they were kind of moving away, like centered at this like University of Krakow, right? Uh, Krakow Academy. They were kind of debating, discussing all the good stuff beyond the scholastic tradition. They are
Hmm.
introducing all the classical learning. They're talking about eloquence. They're talking about all these things, right? Like
Hmm.
I'm now working with as a side project all the 15th century
Hmm.
Krakowian thinkers, and they start to think about the classical learning as a very important part of their education, not only
Hmm.
just this Aristotelian scholastic theology
Hmm.
stuff. And also in the 16th century, like people kind of mark 1543 as the milestone year. Have you heard of this? Like when
As the
Mikołaj Ry
1543.
yeah,
Yes,
Mikołaj
yes,
Ry
yes, yeah.
started to write his work.
Mhm.
Kornowski started to write his work. Um, and like and also Copernicus was writing his thing.
That's
So
right. De Revolutionibus is, yeah,
yes,
1543. Yeah.
so like and also it's kind of connected with the political world, right? Like the late Jagiellonian dynasty, right? There are a lot of like church reforms, political reforms, right? All the like
Hmm.
the Lublin Union, all this that stuff happening at the same time within the 16th
Mm.
century. And also synchronically, we also have the Reformation going on in Poland
Yes.
early in the
Hmm.
16th century, right? The first the Lutherans and then the Calvinism and the Arians, right? The Socinianism, like they were sort of peaceful, but still like it was a very important thing, especially on the political stage, right? How should we deal with those religious dissents or diversities, right? Like what is the role of the king, of the priest? What is the church-state relations? All these things are in the discourse. So it's not like, especially for all Polish people, right? Folks, they're not reading them for fun from the very beginning, I think. They're reading them with sort of like a civic purpose. They take them as sort of a very useful, convenient tool for them to, to teach in the university and also to use it in the politics to deal with contemporary issues. That's kind of my hypothesis, but I still need to think more on that.
So if I think, yeah, I think, right, you have a point there, right? In particular with my dissertation, right, I worked on this humanist Filippo Buonaccorsi, Callimachus experiens, who is an Italian exile, who is an Italian exile, right? He has a full humanistic education at the height of the Studio Humanitatis in the 15th century in Italy. Right, he's exiled for being allegedly involved in this plot to assassinate Pope Paul II. He receives protection by the Archbishop of Lviv, today's Lviv, Grzegorz Owsianok. And quite interestingly, right, his career is even more than, say, civic focused, is sort of statecraft focused, is diplomacy, is how to govern, is how to administer, is maybe how to speak in those regards. His early works in particular are these sort of very limited circulation, sort of didactic works that are written specifically to advise prominent members of the Polish crown's governing apparatus. So, for example, I focused in my dissertation on a biography he had written of his protector Grzegorz Owsianok for the vice chancellor of the crown, Zbigniew Oleśnicki the Younger. So, and he also has written him a couple letters. He was sort of in his, what would you call it, his entourage of sorts. He was on kind of his payroll, kind of an indirect service of the crown. But it's interesting to see how he was relied upon and sort of what sort of things he elected to write in order to be of best service to his patron. And throughout, say, the 1470s, 80s, 90s, even though in other cases he's interested in, say, poetry and he's interested in, Platonic ideas, and he has this correspondence with Marsilio Ficino and with Pico della Mirandola, and he's involved in this. Okay, what is the nature of the soul and dreams and things like this, right? That's not what he's writing to be published. That's fun stuff that he does on the side in his little literary society that he's got in Krakow, and which he has connected to the Renaissance in Florence. So, I mean, that's sort of another question of like, the Renaissance in Poland is many ways the capital R Renaissance because, there are Italians in Poland who are helping contribute to the Renaissance who are also connected back to Italy. So it's like, if we're talking about Buonaccorsi, if we're talking about the late 15th century, the Renaissance in Poland or the Polish Renaissance is one and the same of the Italian Renaissance because it is a continuation of it there. But right, that question is a little bit different when you get to, say, the mid-16th century. But in any case, I think at least what I know from the 15th century Polish or Poland-based humanistic thinkers does support that idea of it being sort of state. How do you run the state? How do you deal with a more complex bureaucracy? And I think to sort of, if I were to think about this question that you raised too, and as a result of me raising it to you, right? What is the Renaissance in Poland? Is there a Renaissance in Poland? one thing perhaps that sets Poland apart is this 13th and 14th century, 12th, 13th, and 14th century legacy of being divided, even into the 15th century, right? Of being divided into all of these smaller principalities, of this, rotation, right? They had this rotational ducal system of, right, one duke will be, or voyevoda or something, or ksiądz will be primus inter pares, and then they'll rotate, sort of something like the Kievan Rus, right? The medieval Russian system. And that doesn't work out so well, right? Because all the princes just kind of do their own thing and they don't really support each other, and the Mongols come in and stir up the pot. But of course, the 14th century and much of the 15th century into the 16th century is this question of how does the kingdom come back together? Because it's a unified kingdom in, say, the 11th century, when it becomes Christianized right at the end of the 10th century. And that falls apart into these fractured states. So, there is a renaissance of Poland as say a political concept that I could see also playing into and supporting, right, your sort of notion of the Renaissance in Poland, or humanism in Poland, being something that's particularly state or politics, well, not politics,
That's
but
very interesting
politically
because
focused.
yeah, in 16th century writings in Poland, we do have tons of kind of words saying like, okay, look at the past, the Polish past, look at your grandfather, look at the Kazimierz the Great, like they're so great emperors, rulers, and now like everything is going too bad, like more degeneration, the rise of nobility is noble, don't do anything. So and also the Ottoman, threat out there. So there are tons of things going on in the 16th century, which there's a small renaissance there. And people talk about like how to use the past, revive the golden age in the past, which is very interesting to think in that kind of diachronic way.
Yeah, right. And of course, it's also interesting at the same time to think about how scholars, especially the sort of the narratives of, like you said, of the present day, look back at, say, the mid 16th century and say that was the Polish Golden Age, that was the Złoty Wiek, yeah. But in the 15th century, they were saying, oh, the 14th century, that was the 16th century. Oh, the 14th century, that was Casimir the Great, like you said, who reunited the kingdom, and yeah, those were the days of great character and moral virtue. Yeah, well, certainly some questions I think for us to continue to think about together outside of this interview. But I had one more question for you, and I think this is a good one for us to end on today.
I also want to talk about Hankins. That's what people are also very interesting, like James Hankins.
Sure.
Because okay, can I? Yeah.
Sure.
I think like,
Before we, yeah.
Like when we talk about Renaissance, like we can just say Renaissance. Like we have to figure out like what is the nature, what is the essence of Renaissance. I think James Hankins offers us an alternative, a new understanding of it, right? Like his 2019 book on virtual politics, right? Like so from this like virtue ethics, everybody knows what that means. Like we read everything about virtue in the Renaissance text, and we also have this civic humanism, that the Baron thesis, right? But like I think what he is doing, he kind of bridged the two things, right? From virtue ethics to civic humanism. There's something in the middle which is called virtual politics, right?
Yes.
As the title of his book calls, or it could be like a virtual signal, like someone else dissertation title is named.
Oh yeah.
And then like between this like virtual ethics and virtual politics, there's something called the soul craft, right? How to crafting your soul, right? Making your prudent, virtuous citizen and a scholar. And then between this virtual politics and the civic humanism, there's something called statecraft, right? How to transit your knowledge of the classical past to and also like how you can internalize it and use it in ruling as an officer or even as a king himself. So what do you think about his book? And also he has a new book. I don't know if you read it. Like
the Patrizzi book, yes, Francesco
Patrici's book on meritocracy, right? Like how like it's not a really new concept, especially if you are very familiar with Friedrich Majewski, right? Like he 200 years after that was he or Polish author wrote about. I'm kind of studying if there's any connection between the two, but it's good to look at it. What do you think? Like, what do you think his books? What do you think? Like in your review, sort of Twitter review, you said a lot of positive things about his books. Are there any negative part, critical points?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm necessarily read enough in general to be able to seriously critique Hankins' reading there. I mean, I'll say that, I mean, this does pertain to this Hankins' book does touch on this deeper question that I've had, right? And it is sort of, is there something human and biological that's sort of underlying this phenomenon of the Renaissance? And one of the reasons I was very interested in humanism was because of its emphasis on, well, as I mentioned in my dissertation, was on value. The idea of conceiving and focusing on value or on ends, as you might say, right? This revival of understanding ethics to necessarily be bound in a world and by goals, right? By things that you must act toward and accomplish or overcome or put forth. And that, trying to understand humanism, because I'll tell you, for years, I did not, like, I was working on this topic in particular because I just didn't understand what humanism was. I didn't get this. Like, I didn't, even after I took Chilensis courses and I was like, this humanism stuff's kind of interesting. But what's going on here? Like, what is this? Is this philology? Like, it's just words are cool. Like, what is this? What's going on?
Don't you
right?
like Garen's thesis? Eugenio Garen.
In terms of them being professional philosophers.
Not
Yeah, I
only
don't think
philosophers, like it's a more like human-centeredness, right? We're moving our eyes from God to human, from this kind of fixed Aristotelian logic to more open Platonian dialogue on like what is human, like what you should think about the human as kind of like the momentum, the motivation for everything, right? It's human intention, which is very important, right? We don't have to listen to the God himself. I think that's the central message I got from.
Yeah, I don't particularly see that occurring, right? In terms, right? Because yeah, of sort of moving away from God and focusing on man. I do see Gurin's point in the humanists not wanting to rely on, Aristotelian rationales and Aristotelian frameworks, and that understanding of God, like God is understood by the scholastics as existing within an Aristotelian framework and an Aristotelian cosmology and within an Aristotelian physical world, and using those kind of principles and, Aristotle's four causes as how to understand everything and form an action, right? That's useful, right? And I don't think, I do see what he means as far as the humanists wanting to move away from that. I mean, even in the context of Buonaccorsi in right, the 1470s, he's kind of using, by what has become at that point, sort of humanist commonplaces of, let's try to explain natural philosophy. For example, let's try to explain the soul, this part of human nature, using natural philosophy and not scholastic theology.
Yeah,
and by the way, if you want to understand natural philosophy, then you better have your languages down, right? You better have rhetoric. You better have read the poets. There's no way, right? He says, I think in the biography of Grzegorz of Sanok, he has this kind of, Grzegorz was known to say, right, whether this is the case or not, this is what's in the biography, that he that attempted to approach natural science and philosophy without first having read the poets, rather attempted to enter a city by jumping over the wall rather than walking through its open gate. Something like that, right? So this sort of this idea of, there is a program and there is a way of approaching these things that is different from, the especially university hold on the natural sciences that was fixed within this Aristotelian cosmology. But
I think that's
as
exactly,
far,
sorry, going back to Hankins, if we can. I think
yeah,
he's exactly emphasizing on this, like, we should do self-cultivation, right? We're not just talking about like learning for fun, right? Or statecraft, right? Between those two, there's something more like a kind of self nourishment, kind of teach yourself to be a virtuous citizen, basically. That is like, according to him, like the idea of patrici. There are two patrici, right? Patrici, Francisco Patrici of Siena, patrici in the 16th century world, happy city, like there are two. But like, for me, like Hankins' two books, although they are very good first read, erudition and well written, well read, I think they are not really surprising. Like they are kind of following this line of Renaissance as virtue, and like it's not counterintuitive enough for me. And that's kind of my only criticism on that. Um, I would be amazed if he argued something opposite, like technotopia or like tyrannic. But I don't know, like, but maybe as Renaissance historians, as us, like we should think maybe a little bit beyond the boundary of this whole discourse of intellectual trends. Maybe for me, especially, I'm also a cultural historian, so I think a little bit deep, right? Like what was behind all this, reading classics, eloquence, even civic humanism. What was behind? What was the real mentality, right, behind all these things? What is the human reason? I have not figured it out, but that's something I'm working on for 16th century Poland.
yeah, yeah,
Um, I think there are two things about that, like premises. First, like we should not talk about originality, right? It's not about originality. A lot of ideas were adopted by Polish authors from their Italian predecessors, right? If we talk about originality, then Poland will fall behind, right? But we talk about like this contextuality, right? How they use the ideas in the Polish scenario for what kind of personal, intellectual, cultural reasons. That's something I'm trying to figure out for my protagonists, right? I think there's something behind there, right? Like in my not discipline, but in my book, tentative book title, right? I would call like their kind of hope, anxiety, and also utopian future, futuristic mentality that happening in Poland. Um, it's more profound than their Italian counterparts, who they also have like realistic concerns, but they kind of they have an idea of revival the past because the Roman world was part of their legacy tradition. But for Poland, it's like all of these are sort of new to them. So they're learning those things and they're thinking about their own state mostly, right? They're thinking about how to build a better Poland in the future. So it's kind of like the Kutna Hora, like the more 20th century idea, right? Like they want to build a better Rzeczpospolita, right? Like they want to think about imagine a future, maybe with Lithuania, the Union, or maybe even Poland itself, right? How can we make a strong Poland while it is still democratic and republican, right? From that line of thought, I'm trying to work on that part.
Yeah, I think that's a worthwhile avenue of pursuit, definitely. And I think especially this question of in what ways are humanists genuinely thinking differently, perhaps, than some of their intergenerational counterparts, something like that in the intellectual and cultural history of the West. I think you're right. Hankins' book does sort of follow sort of an existing pattern, right, in this tradition of thinking about civic humanism. Though I think he does make some good observations, right? Maybe not paradigm shifting, but there are a number of questions, sort of, for example, he does this question of, okay, is Machiavelli, for example, is he part of this humanistic tradition, or right, because the civic humanists come along and say, right, there's the civic tradition, civic tradition, civic tradition, then Machiavelli is something different. And I think he does this good job of demonstrating how there is this kind of continuum of a kind of political idealism and a political pragmatism. And this kind of alternation is consummate within one tradition. It is this tradition. It's the Renaissance tradition. Machiavelli is just reversing course on that pragmatism arc based on the environmental, for the term avant la lettre, right, geopolitical circumstances of the late 15th and the early 16th century.
This could be connected to the big picture. Maybe we'll end here. Like this idea of Machiavelli as a canon. Like we are speaking as intellectual historians of the Renaissance as like internal members, but for other people, for philosophers, for political scientists, right, theorists, they regard Machiavelli as the founding father of modern Western political theory, period. Right? They're not talking about other like more secondary figures, but that we know very well, but they don't know anything about that. And even for philosophers, which is even more interesting, right? Because they don't think Renaissance has a philosophy, right? They would move from Aquinas to Occam, and then all the way jump to Descartes. Like Leibniz, Hume, Locke, Berkeley, all these people count. They're not taking Renaissance seriously. Ficino is not philosopher, Machiavelli is not philosopher. They're just like thinkers, right? So that's also a thing, like how these Renaissance people were received and perceived by people from other disciplines, also from the grand audience, right? People, they might know Machiavelli only, and then they know about Shakespeare, which is interesting. Like I ask my student, they know Shakespeare, but they don't know anything about Sidney, Spencer, and Marlowe, or the other. Equally, even better, right? Like where Shakespeare borrowed a lot of things from Spencer and Sidney, but it's very pity how the general public understand the history, the period. From that perspective, maybe we should decolonize or decanonize, right, the known figures, and to give them more, lessons, courses, books on other minor figures, minor cultures, minor countries, even within the European continent, right? We're not talking about yet to other parts of the world, but there are still a lot of work to do. Like for example, like we should definitely think about do some translation projects, right? You should translate Grzegorz Sanoka and also other, Trechmashevsky and other works from, at least from Latin to English, so that Anglophone readers could enjoy them first. They have to read first, right? That's the most important thing. They cannot just listen and then give the opinions and reject from the very beginning. So that's my going back to our theme.
No, great. Hey, that's gonna be up to us to experiment with. And hey, if there's anybody out there certainly listening to this, if you're interested in being the first to translate some dusty Latin text that was all the rage in the 15th and 16th century, but is since laid in a library since, I think Vaclav can join me here in inviting you to join the field of Renaissance studies,
and also
in East
be
Central
aware
Europe.
that translation itself is a canon making process, right? So the most important thing is that you should learn the language, read the original, enjoy the kind of the texture of the language, of the writing themselves. That's very important. So all your effort on working, like reviving the Latin tradition, the Latin language teaching is very important and very vulnerable, I think, like for modern readers, especially in North America.
I happen to agree with you on that point too. So excellent, Vaclav. Thank you. Tell us just before we go, so our listeners can follow you. What's the best way to stay in touch with your projects? How can we find you?
I mean, I have a Twitter account and I
Mm-hmm.
have you can email me. And I think I'm going to build a personal website soon for job market
Okay.
purpose to be more visible. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a few things forthcoming in publications, like journal
Mm-hmm.
article chapters. And I'm
Okay.
even working on a translation project. I can tell you later on that. But I'm trying to produce things
Mm-hmm.
and for English readers, right? Like I think like
Mm-hmm.
we exist as very few like this like rare species of
Mm-hmm.
Renaissance Polish scholars. We have this duty responsibility to transmit
Mm-hmm.
knowledge ideas to
Mm-hmm.
a grand reader public, right? There are enough Italian needs we need more Polish,
Yes.
Bohemian, Slavicists, which this is a no man's field again. Like we need more people joining us and working on this and kind of giving more public lectures and people could know and learn and read with us. That's
Yes.
ideal. Maybe in 20
Yes.
years. So
Yes. Yes. Yes.
again, like going back to our original question, is there a Renaissance now? Probably no, but do we need a Renaissance? Yes. Especially do we need a Polish Renaissance? Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a nice yeah, that's a nice cap off, right? If you're interested, right, in joining the Polish Renaissance, sign up to learn Latin, and you too can uncover the mysteries of the Renaissance in East Central Europe. Václav, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a
Thank
great
you.
conversation. It was great to connect, and I'll look forward potentially in the future, right? Maybe once you've completed your dissertation, or you're interested in telling us perhaps more about some of your future publications or translation projects. Certainly
Yeah.
love to have you back. So thanks so
I'll keep
much.
you posted. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and thank you everyone for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Bye now.